Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here today for the Faculty Research Showcase hosted as part of WiSys' 2021 Spark Virtual Series. I'm Jennifer Souter, WiSys' Director of Patents and Licensing. For those of you not familiar with WiSys, we are a nonprofit supporting organization of the UW system. At WiSys, we support research, we protect and market ideas, we inspire students, and we build culture, all with the goal of inspiring Wisconsin innovation. On behalf of WiSys, we are delighted to be able to showcase UW system faculty from a variety of academic disciplines as part of this live broadcast. Each of today's speakers have been the recipients of applied research grant funding directed towards the development of innovative solutions with potential for both significant economic as well as societal impact. So today you're going to be hearing from UW System Regent Scholars, UW System Ignite Grant recipients, and WiSys Spark Grant awardees. And on that note, on behalf of WiSys, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Regent Kyle Weatherly, who is joining us today on behalf of the UW System for opening remarks. Regent Weatherly was appointed to the UW System Board of Regents in May 2020 and chaired the 2021 UW System Regent Scholar Review Committee and has served as a reviewer for past grant cycles for both Regent Scholar Program as well as the Ignite Grant Program for Applied Research. Regent Weatherly, we are delighted to have you with us today, and you are most welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer, for giving me the opportunity to welcome you and everyone else. And on behalf of the Board of Regents, I do indeed want to welcome you, and more importantly, thank you. The Regents quite often brag about the billions of dollars of economic impact the UW system research contributes to the state. However, funny thing is, us Regents aren't the one doing the research. It is you and people like you. So, as a UW system alum, UW system Regent, and a Wisconsinite, thank you very much. I am very excited to hear more about everyone's progress. Having reviewed much of what will be presented today, I am very excited that the next tomotherapy, Stratotect, cellular dynamics, et cetera, will be seen today. Thank you again for your time and your efforts, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 hours together.
Thanks very much, Regent Weatherly. So a few notes of housekeeping just before we get started with our presenters. To get the most out of your viewing experience today, we encourage you to use Speaker View and ask that you leave your audio and video off during the duration of the main presentations. During each presentation, we ask that you submit questions into the chat log, and we will address those questions once each speaker has finished and during the subsequent networking sessions. Following the first 3 presentations, we will move into a short networking breakout to allow for further Q&A with the first group of faculty presenters. And at the conclusion of the second group of presentations, we will continue with the same breakout format, allowing for further Q&A and discussion by closing remarks. Now, without further ado, I am very pleased to welcome our first speaker, UW System Regent Scholar, Dr. Jok Bhattacharya from UW-Whitewater. Jok, you are most welcome.
Thanks, Jennifer. Can you guys hear me? Okay, my presentation is on developing and testing a prototype multimodal device for monitoring slope instability. And in this presentation, I'm being the presenter, but I have collaborators. Next slide, please. So on my campus, my collaborators are Oscar Yavusetin from physics, Haijian Sun from computer science. So we are tackling this problem on a multidisciplinary approach. And we have students, Brett, Nick, Gabe, Esther, Riley, Michaela, and Peyton, who are very much engaged and involved in this project and are making serious contributions to our project. And this project was funded by the 2020 UW System Regent Scholar. Next slide, please. So this project deals with landslides or slope failures. Now, these things happen all over the world, caused by excessive rainfall or high moisture content in soil. Weathering and erosion patterns exacerbate the problem that makes it harder. But the biggest thing that happens, and happens closer to home, is when we have slopes that get steeper and steeper by natural or human actions. So in Lake Michigan, for example, the lake actions, the lake erosions undercut the slope and makes them steeper. Then you add a house or something on unstable slope. That becomes a dangerous situation. Next slide, please. As you can see from these figures, these are all real pictures of destruction where houses are built on unstable slopes. And with the more and more houses being built with increasing urbanization, and because of global climate change, the precipitation patterns changing, the freeze-thaw cycle is becoming more intense, the lake level is changing, the lake erosion is happening more and more. So all of them are making landslides hazards more and more likely where they didn't used to be a problem. So our approach is real-time monitoring, and that's we think is essential for finding the rate of slope erosion. And so we can provide information in a timely manner to landowners and to first responders to reduce risks and to make people be safe. Next slide, please. So our goal was to create a prototype multimodal sensing device that can measure or that can monitor multiple triggers in real time. So we created this prototype using soil moisture sensors and digital temperature sensors on a Raspberry Pi platform. Next slide, please. We use Raspberry Pi platform because it is more flexible, so we can stack up different Pi plates to add more and more sensors. So you're not limited to just temperature and moisture. So we can add other sensors to address problems in specific locations. So next slide, please. We are also considering ultrasonic sensors for measuring distance, how much a slope is moving away from a fixed point, real-time clock or GPS to give precise timestamps for our data collection, and strain gauge load cell for finding creep. This is imperceptible movement in a slope that happens before a collapse happens. So if we can record and monitor slow creeping movement of slopes, then we should be able to find our information in a timely manner to say, okay, this slope is becoming unstable, maybe you should do something about it. So our goal is to find the best combination of different sensors for specific locations where maybe rainfall is a problem, maybe soil moisture is a problem, and mix and match the sensors to give a multi-modular device to monitor slope instability. Next slide, please. So moving forward, our computer science team are writing the codes for each sensor, and we are individually testing the sensors to integrate them into the whole system. We are developing code for each sensor, and then once we find the code for individual sensors, we'll develop a code library, and then we can mix and match sensors as we need it. Next slide, please. So we are testing our prototype that you already got. We are testing it out on campus and in a farm field. So we are looking at waterproofing, weatherproofing, whether we put the electronics in 90 plus temperature so that they overheat. Can we get the battery to stay on, data collection? So we are testing out these things on campus outside. Next slide, please. We are also testing the sensors within lab in a sandbox to see our moisture sensors. Can they record moisture as they flow through sand or unconsolidated material? We are using play sand for some of the experiments. Advance, please. In our plastic bins, we are mimicking freeze-thaw cycle using liquid nitrogen. Freeze-thaw cycle happens in winter when water freezes in cracks and they expand, and the water doesn't allow liquid water to move past, so the water becomes under pressure. In the thawing season, that extra pressure in water causes slopes to become weak. And so we are in the lab, we're trying to see if we can replicate the freeze-thaw cycle using liquid nitrogen to create cold spots. Advance. Our preliminary data show there is indeed we can make the moisture move in response to colder temperature, but we need a lot more experiments to see if the amount of moisture moving in response to temperature gradient is that enough to make a slope destabilize. Advance, please. So these are some of our experimental setup. We are trying to see if we can make a groundwater move on a vertical profile, so coming from underground onto the surface, or can we add enough water in forms of snow melts to make the slopes destabilize? Next slide. We have a good team of students and they're all working on this. We are trying to see if we can model the impact of Lake Michigan as the lake level rises and undercuts our slope. Can we mimic that in a laboratory setting? Next slide. We are also using different grain sizes because our sand that we used for a lot of these experiments are uniform. So now we are trying to see if the different grains in the sand bucket, can they impact water movement with different permeability, and can that have an impact on slope instability? We are also adding a component of lake erosion patterns. So we are mimicking groins that are hard stabilization structures perpendicular to the lake shore that can change longshore current patterns and increase erosions in some areas. So we're trying to replicate that phenomenon in a lab situation. Next slide, please. And we are all taking all these laboratory experiments into Port Washington. We are working with the township to provide them some answers for stabilizing their bluffs. They have a nice steep bluff near their North Shore beach, and that bluff is actually slumping. You can see on the picture on the left that a slump is covering the access road on the beach. My student is standing next to the slump that is covering up the road. Next slide, please. And the bluff area is pretty steep. It is about 60 to 70 degrees steep there. And you can see it is very fine grained. There's lots of clay materials. And the water doesn't get absorbed as much, but it creates a lot of surface erosion. There is not much vegetation. So you get rills, and there are some pretty deep gullies there. So these make slopes very unstable. So we are trying to use our lab and our electronics patents into bringing up solutions for the community. Next slide, please. So the final slides, our future steps are we are testing and calibrating different sensors and figuring out what other sensors would be needed. And then we are going to field test the multimodal device in a field situation. And I'll stop and take any comments, questions at this point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joke. Do we have any questions from the attendees? Please feel free to just turn on your camera and audio if you want to ask a question directly. There'll also be opportunity to ask questions in our networking session. Well, Joke, I have a question if no one else does. I'm just curious of what other methods currently exist for this type of monitoring, and are there other real-time monitoring technologies out there? And if so, what are their deficiencies?
There are lots of different monitoring devices. The USGS uses remote sensing images. So you take satellite image and see how the slopes are, either they're stable or not. GPS is used a lot for seeing how the slopes are moving. There are also local monitoring devices that also measures what we are measuring to some extent, but there is no any one standardized device to measure all the different triggers that are in use. And each of these monitoring devices have their positives and negatives. Like if you're looking at a satellite image, for example, it can tell you like a time snap of every month, but it doesn't tell you what's happening on a daily or a weekly basis. Recently, there was a massive glacial mud that went into a village in my country in the northern India. It just fell, and apparently it was creeping down for about 4 years, and they could see it. Hindsight is 2020. So they went and analyzed the images and they could see the creep happening, but the data wasn't available for anybody to do anything about it. So this module kind of does what the others are not doing, like looking at the granular basis, like local, what's happening in the certain area. And we are going to move on to having the devices talk to each other. to share data from multiple devices to get an overall bigger picture. So that's the gap that we are trying to fill, that we have large-scale measurement techniques, but nothing small-scale for local areas like that.
Well, thanks very much. No, that's really, really fantastic. One question through the chat. Do the devices need to be modified to analyze large landforms, or are they in their final form?
They are not in their final form. Landslides depends on, it's very much case-based. So it depends on what kind of soil or bedrock you have, what kind of weather and climate there is. So anything that we are looking at Lake Michigan, it's till and sand and clay. It's going to be very different along the shores of Lake Superior, which is more rock, as in sandstone and basalt. It's going to be very different in Minnesota, where it is limestone. So all these modules should be, and we are aiming for, to be very location specific. So the sensors, that's why we have the capacity of switching the sensors in and out. So if we can take the device here, we need a temperature probe because freeze thaw is a big deal in Wisconsin. It will not be a big deal in Puerto Rico. They have lots of mudslides, they have lots of rainfall, but temperature doesn't drop below freezing. So all these, we are trying to get this flexibility to figure out which sensor you're going to use under what conditions. So yeah, that's another thing that we have that a lot of the other devices that do not have, that we are more flexible in analyzing small or large landforms. Our computer scientists are looking at ways that the devices talk to each other. And so there's an intranet before they put the big data. So each module, say, covers a small area, then you have 3 of the modules interlinked talking to each other, and then we get a bigger coverage, and then have these networks of modules covering an entire area. So that's kind of the plan.
Oh, thank you very much, Duc. It's really exciting research, and we're looking forward to seeing the outcomes as your research progresses. So thanks very much again for being here with us today. All right, next up, I'd like to have everyone welcome me in joining our next speaker, UW System Regent Scholar, Dr. Karen Frick from UW Milwaukee. Karen, you are most welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to speak with you about our work on targeting estrogen receptor beta as a treatment for hot flashes and memory loss in menopausal women. And you're all probably familiar with the role of estrogens in reproduction and that they're produced in organs like the testes and the ovaries. But you may not appreciate the fact that estrogens are produced in many tissues in the body, including in the central nervous system. Next. Thank you. Where there are certainly estrogens are produced in the brain, and there are receptors, estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta, located throughout the brain, including in cognitive regions of the brain that are important for memory and decision-making and concentration. And it turns out that these neurons, these communication cells in the brain, come to depend on estrogens for proper functioning. And so next slide, please. And so in menopause, hormone estrogen levels drop precipitously. So in the 20s and 30s and 40s, estrogen levels are high in women. And then in the 40s, they begin to decline precipitously. And then they're quite low in the 50s and beyond. And we think that the loss of these estrogens puts these neurons in cognitive regions of the brain at greater risk for, they're more vulnerable to age-related changes, age-related pathologies that occur in an older brain, as well as in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. So we think that the loss of estrogens really have significant impact, next please, in creating an array of symptoms that many women experience, including hot flashes, which are sudden increases in temperature that cause profuse sweating and much embarrassment for women, changes in anxiety and depression and irritability. And for our purposes here today, impairments in concentration and memory and Alzheimer's and increased Alzheimer's disease risk. Next slide. These data just show you some information from the Alzheimer's Association on the estimated lifetime risks of developing Alzheimer's disease at ages 65 75, and 85, with men in the purple and women in the gold. And you can see that at each age, women are far more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than men. Next slide, please. One more time. Thank you. Nope, just go back one. Perfect. So if the loss of estrogens lead to an array of symptoms and increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, then hormone therapy or estrogen therapy seems to be, may on the surface seem to be a good treatment. But while there's some good effects on bone health and cholesterol profile and in reducing some of the menopausal symptoms like hot flashes, there are some detrimental effects, small but statistically significant risks of breast cancer, uterine cancer, blood clots, and stroke. So estrogen therapy is not generally prescribed for purposes of, say, cognition enhancement because of these side effects, particularly in women who have a personal or family history of cancer. So next. Right, and so of those two estrogen receptors, they're not equal in terms of the risks they confer for particularly cancer. So ER alpha, for instance, increases cell proliferation and tumor growth in cancers, whereas ER beta decreases those variables. Next. And so to simplify things, for some of the side effects associated with hormone therapy, ER alpha is bad, ER beta is good, and current therapies are not so great because they're not selective for one receptor over the other. And so I and my collaborators have formed a company called Estrogenics, where our solution is to try to target specifically ER beta to reap the benefits of estrogens without some of these side effects. Next slide, please. The problem historically with targeting ER beta with existing agonists is that they're not all that selective for ER beta. So they're only about 70-fold more selective for beta over alpha. So they can still bind to alpha at these higher doses. So we wondered if we could develop a more selective ER beta agonist to safely treat those hot flashes and memory loss. So next. So in collaboration with Bill Donaldson, a synthetic chemist at Marquette, and Dan Sem, a pharmacologist at Concordia University of Wisconsin, we've formed a company called Estrogenics to develop these compounds. Next, please. So here you see our lead compound is called EGX358. It's outlined here in red, layered on top of, in black, behind it is 17-beta estradiol, and that's the most potent of the estrogens. And EGX358 binds ER beta with a very high potency and extremely high selectivity. So it's 750-fold more selective for beta than for alpha, which is 10 times greater than current available treatments. We've also done some preliminary safety studies suggesting that it doesn't bind to other nuclear hormone receptors. There's no effect on metabolism or breast cancer cell proliferation or gross tissue pathology. So we wondered about its effects on memory. Next slide, please. We tested this compound in a variety of tasks, but I'm just going to focus on this one here that we call object recognition. We test how well animals can remember objects that they've seen before. And so initially in training, animals are placed in a big white box with two identical objects placed near the corners, and they're allowed to stay in the box until they've accumulated 30 seconds exploring those objects. Then 2 days later, we put them back in the box and allow them to explore an object identical to training and a novel object. And because mice are inherently drawn to novelty, if they remember the familiar training object, they're going to spend more time with exploring the new object. Next, please. Okay, so you'll see here a series of data showing you that our EGX compound does enhance memory. So on the y-axis, you see time spent with the two objects. 15 seconds, that dashed line is chance. That means if animals are at that line, a group is at that line, they're not showing enhanced memory. The blue bar there is an established ER beta agonist with a relatively only 70-fold selectivity for ER beta, but yet it enhances memory. And you can see here in the pinkish reddish bars, those are our novel compound EGX, and a couple of doses there do enhance memory. In this case, we infuse the drug directly into a region of the brain called the dorsal hippocampus, or DH, but we've also seen beneficial effects next if we inject it intraperitoneally directly into the abdomen, and next if we treat the animals orally with various doses of EGX. So it enhances memory. Next slide, please. We've also looked at hot flashes. So I forgot to mention in the last slide, these studies are done with young mice whose ovaries have been removed, so we have control over the amount of estrogens that they're getting. In this case, we induce a hot flash in these mice with a drug called Sengtide. Next. So mice can't sweat and they don't pant like dogs. They have to release heat using out their tails. And on the top image here, you see is a control animal treated with a vehicle substance having a nice cool tail. On the bottom, you see an animal treated with Sengtide, which triggers heat release in the tail. Next slide, or sorry, next there, thank you. What Sengtide does is cause a very rapid increase in temperature that comes back down very quickly. And in this rather complicated figure, you can see in the black symbols, these are animals treated with Sengtide plus a control vehicle substance. And you see a high increase in tail temperature that comes back down fairly quickly. All of the other colors are estrogen compounds. So E2 is 17-beta estradiol, DPN is this established ER-beta agonist, and EGX is, of course, our compound. And all of those compounds reduce the magnitude of that hot flash, suggesting that EGX is as effective as natural estradiol. Next slide, please. So what about our Regent Scholar Award? We were delayed in starting the Regent Scholar Award thanks to COVID, because we had to, the project is to test this EGX358 in a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease. And because of the pandemic, we weren't able to breed the mice until a few months ago. We're working with a colleague in Chicago who has a special Alzheimer's mouse that has 5 familial Alzheimer's disease mutations associated with early onset Alzheimer's, plus a couple of variants of a protein called apolipoprotein E, which is the leading risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease, what most people develop. And there are multiple forms of apolipoprotein E, but they all help in disposing of this protein called beta amyloid that builds up and gunks up the Alzheimer's brain. The variant called ApoE has no, people who have expressed that have no increased risk of Alzheimer's, but people who have 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4 do have an increased risk because E4 is not as effective as the other forms of ApoE at disposing of beta amyloid. So patients with ApoE have more and earlier brain pathology and worse dementia. And women in particular with ApoE4 are at the greatest risk of developing Alzheimer's. Next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to know whether chronic oral treatment with EGX358 could improve memory in mice carrying 2 copies of ApoE, we call those E3 fads, or 1 copy of ApoE and 1 of ApoE4, we call those E34 fads. Can you, thank you. So we, like I said, the animals are in my lab right now. We have just started treating them with EGX358. So what I'm showing you here are data from a similar experiment where we treated them with treated animals with these varying ApoE compositions with the vehicle compound or estradiol. And what we expect to see with our EGX compound is something akin to the effects of estradiol, where we expect, or at least we hope to see that that EGX will improve memory in our E3 animals and our E34 animals. We generally don't expect to see an effect in E4s because we haven't with estradiol. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, and I want to mention that this work is being done by 2 graduate students, Erin Fleischer and Miranda Schwab in my lab, who are working with several undergraduates who are working with us this semester and will continue into the fall to conduct this work. Thank you very much. This is just to acknowledge my students, our support, and especially the UW system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Frick. Are there any questions for Dr. Frick? Please feel free to enter them through the chat or turn your video and audio on and ask directly. One question through the chat, is it known why ER alpha is so strongly associated with negative side effects?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We're still trying to understand that. I think it has to do in large part with the cellular mechanisms that ER alpha and ER beta, the differential signaling mechanisms within cells that those 2 receptors interact with. ER alpha seems to be it's sort of a double-edged sword. Early in development, the kind of cell proliferation that is promoted by ER alpha is good, but later in life, it's one of these things that too much cell proliferation is actually a bad thing. So ER alpha just happens to interact with the cellular mechanisms that promote cell proliferation more than ER beta.
Thanks very much. And I guess I have a quick question too, is, what's next for Estrogenics?
Well, that's a good question. So we're continuing to do some additional preclinical work with EGX. We have plans to do more pharmacokinetic work to, get a better profile of the safety and toxicity, potential safety and toxicity of the compound. We also have a couple of new compounds that look super promising in our in vitro studies that we'd like to take into in vivo work with the mice as well. So, so there's a lot of exciting directions that we're planning to head.
Well, that's really great. Well, so stay tuned, I guess, for more coming out. So, well, thank you again, Dr. Fick. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, I'd like you to please join me in welcoming our next speaker, UW System Regent Scholar and co-chair of this year's WiSys Spark Symposium, Dr. Elizabeth Glogowski from UW Eau Claire. Liz, you're most welcome.
Thank you for inviting me to present our research here at the symposium. So today I'll be talking about our work synthesizing and characterizing stimuli responsive copolymers for architectural coatings. And I've listed the team of undergraduate researchers who've been working on it this summer, plus a whole army of researchers over the past few years. So next slide, please. What are architectural coatings? Architectural coatings are paints, primers, and stains, including interior and exterior applications. This is a growing market, and as of 2016, it was valued at $26 billion in North America and Europe. And so we think about the technology involved in architectural coatings and who the target consumers are and customers. And so with this work, synthesizing a new polymer dispersant for architectural coatings, we've been reaching out and working with manufacturers of coatings and polymers. And then ultimately, of course, who uses the paints, primers, and stains? That's going to be your home consumer, plus the larger scale would be contractors. And what's interesting and unique about the technology I'll be talking about today is that it's an additive technology. So this means we don't have to start a formulation from scratch. We can take a new technology such as ours and add it to existing formulations, which is greatly appealing to the manufacturers. So next slide, please. So what problem are we trying to solve specifically? A major component of an architectural coating is the titanium dioxide pigment. And so the titanium dioxide is necessary to get the opacity or coverage of the coating. And so the better dispersed the titanium dioxide is, the more effective the coating will be. And the better dispersed it is, the less titanium dioxide we need to add. So of course, if we need less titanium dioxide, that means the cost is less for this component. The environmental impact is less because there's an environmental cost for producing the titanium dioxide. And then there has been supply chain volatility in the past for titanium dioxide, which we're now all very familiar across the board with supply chain volatility and how much that can really affect every step of product development and procurement. And so the less titanium dioxide we need, the less we need to worry about that. And if we can improve the dispersion of the titanium dioxide within an architectural coating, that will enhance new applications. So the two that are of great interest to consumers are one coat hide and paint and primer in one application. So if you've ever tried to paint like a red wall and make it a beige wall like I've done at home, you can't just put one coat of paint, even if you buy the best paint out there right now. You have to do a couple coats of primer and then a couple coats of the color that you want in order to get that coverage. So if we can improve our dispersion of the titanium dioxide, we can improve those specialty applications that are greatly appealing to consumers. And the environmental impact, we can address that as well. So one aspect is that there are volatile organic compounds that are needed to improve the dispersion of the titanium dioxide. More consumers are interested in decreasing those VOCs and increasing water-based paints. And so one technology that's needed for that is improved titanium dioxide dispersion through polymer dispersants. So next slide, please. So what is our proposed technology solution? We've been working with stimuli responsive polymers, and we're looking at these as polymer dispersants, as I said, for the titanium dioxide. Now, titanium dioxide particulates are not used directly or in their raw form, because the titanium dioxide can actually degrade organic components over time. And so they're all coated with different potential coatings. The most common one is an aluminum oxide based coating. And sometimes they mix in silicon dioxide and zirconium oxides. And so that changes the surface chemistry of the titanium dioxide particulates. And so the dispersant that's used needs to be adaptable for those coatings as well. And so with our stimuli responsive polymers, they adapt to whatever particulate coating is in play. And so our specific polymers are both pH and temperature responsive. For this application, we're looking specifically more at the pH responsive aspect because of the different surface coatings. But ultimately, based on the polymer structure, we can tailor the response of the polymers to make sure they're the ideal dispersants. Next slide, please. So because we've filed the patent and with extreme help from WiSys, we can talk more about the polymer structure we've been looking at. So we've been looking at diblock and triblock copolymers. So by changing the architecture, we change the properties that we observe for these materials. So we've looked at a wide array of different polymer structures. Like I mentioned, both the diblock and the triblocks. The blue component is a fixed water-soluble block, and then the green piece is the part that's stimuli responsive. And so it will change properties in response to a change in pH and or temperature. And so by changing the length of these blocks and the ratio of the different blocks, we change the stimuli responsive properties and can tune them for each formulation and application. To date, we've been using a controlled free radical polymerization approach, which gives us well-defined block length and architecture. But we've also been working on being able to scale these up for commercial applications and looking at different architectures, which can't yet talk about because we haven't yet patented them, but that's the focus of the Regent Scholar work, to be able to expand the different structures that we look at, because obviously changing the structure changes those stimuli responsive properties. And so there's many properties that we've tested, everything from water solubility to viscosity, viscoelasticity. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss all of those today, but I would like to talk about one of those, which if we go to the next slide, I can show you in detail. So one test that we do to understand how well these polymers behave as dispersants for titanium dioxide is called the demand curve. So in the demand curve, we're testing the viscosity as a function of polymer concentration. So in this case, the particle concentration is fixed. So for these tests, the particle concentration is 6 volume percent, or about 20 weight percent. And then we vary the polymer concentration. So what we expect, and what you can see with the pure dashed lines, is that as we increase the polymer concentration, whether it's our synthesized polymer or a commercial dispersant called TAMOL, as you increase that polymer concentration, you see an increase in the viscosity. What we're looking for and what we expect is to have a high initial viscosity when we first mix a low polymer concentration with the fixed particle concentration. Then if we have an effective dispersant, we will see a dip in a minimum in the viscosity. And then when the polymer behavior takes over, as we increase the polymer concentration, then we see an increase, or expect to see an increase in the viscosity again. So the ideal polymer concentration for a dispersant is that minimum in the viscosity. And so we've done this initial testing, and with the graph with the log scale, it's a little bit difficult to read the actual values of the minimum. So I pulled those out into a table. And so what we see is that if we look at the values of the viscosity, they're the same order of magnitude for the minimum compared to our reference dispersant. And then the concentration needed to achieve that viscosity is in line with the commercially available dispersant. And I mentioned working with national coating manufacturers. And so what we're doing is expanding that testing to expand to higher concentrations for the particles and lower concentration for the polymers to really push the limit and see where the absolute minimum is in the viscosity, to understand, at least initially for this initial mixture, how does our dispersant behave? And then next steps will be to test a full formulation, right, with defoamers and the actual latex and pigments and things like that. But so far we have promising results that we're continuing to work on testing and working with manufacturers to be able to move forward with this. So next slide, please. So yeah, I'd like to thank, these are the students working this summer. This picture makes me happy because we went from all on Zoom wearing masks, right, to at least we're not exactly shoulder to shoulder yet, but spread out, socially distanced, but working in the lab together. So I wouldn't have been able to complete this work without the support, both through funding and through the intellectual property aspects along the way, both from UW system and WiSys, and then the fundamental research from the National Science Foundation. So with that, we can go to the next slide. Just to have some conclusions up, but I'm happy to take any questions at this time. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Liz. Any questions from the audience, please, again, feel free to enter into the chat or just turn your video and audio on and ask directly. And there'll be some more time in just a moment as well with the group. Guess while we're waiting to see if anyone has a question, Liz, I'll ask, when you mentioned kind of working with manufacturers and industry, and just curious from your perspective, how important has that input been for you in your research and the design of your experiments as you take this forward?
Yeah, that's been extremely helpful because, you know, I have a, you know, fundamental polymer science background, right? I understand all of the fundamental structure property relationships, right? But they bring in that coding expertise and help guide the experiments and really, you know, increase the impact of the experiments that we're doing going forward to be able to talk to industrial partners about next steps.
Oh, that's great. No, I'm glad to hear that. I think it sounds like it's going well, and we look forward to seeing more results from you. So thanks very much. Well, thanks again to all of our UW System Regent scholars. I'd really like to thank Liz, Karen, and Juk for their insightful presentations today, and really congratulate each of you again for being named UW System Regent scholars for the 1920 grant cycle. So we're going to move into our just breakout session here, where we'll take additional questions from the audience. I'd welcome all speakers at this point and attendees to turn on their cameras and switch to gallery view for a more interactive experience. And again, please feel free to raise your hand directly and ask direct questions, or again, I'm happy to moderate things through the chat feature. So I'll stop my sharing right now and we'll open up for discussion. And if there's not any further questions, we'll move on to the next presentation, but I want to give everybody a chance to speak. So please feel free to ask questions at this stage. Don't be shy. Well, I'll maybe start off while people are maybe gathering some thoughts around questions. Each of you, Regent Scholars, a big component of that program is focused on undergraduate research training, student training in general. If I could maybe ask each of you to just say a few words about how important that's been for your research and, what you think it does to benefit your students. So Juk, I'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, my undergraduate students are kind of been my sanity keeper through the COVID year. And you probably know that they're presented in the last 2 showcases and are going to present in the next one for the August 11th. So for training undergraduate students, getting them into the lab and actually trying to find a problem that solves a real issue, like something that they can walk outside and see happening, and then they go to the lab and try to find a solution, is incredibly valuable. And I am also blessed to have undergraduate students from multiple disciplines. One of my students is an art major. I have geology, physics, computer science, and graphic design all working together. And we recently got a couple other students. One is interested in library science and hate science and math pretty much. But research is for everybody, and every student can bring their experience and skills, and just working as a team and brainstorming and trying out different ideas and then figure out what went wrong and how can we make it correct. It's incredible. This is just one of the best ways of teaching. I'm going to shut up and let others speak.
Oh, that's really great. Thank you so much. Karen, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having undergraduates in the lab is, we couldn't do our work without them. They're incredibly valuable participants. We usually pre-COVID would have probably 6 or 7 students doing research with us at any given time in the lab, where they're involved in all aspects of what we do, surgery and behavioral testing and drug administration and brain analysis. So, it was very challenging for us during the COVID year to figure out ways in which they could be involved in research, but they stuck with us, and we found activities that they could do at home to help us analyze data and continue moving forward. And we just have been delighted that this summer we've been able to welcome the undergraduates back into the lab, and we've got 4 of them, I think, now this summer who are doing research through various programs on campus. So, and we have several more who will be joining us, returning in the fall in person. So, yeah, they've been the lifeblood of what we do. We couldn't do our work without them.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And Liz?
Yeah, so I mentioned, I have a whole team of undergraduate researchers, and I could not do what I do without them, right? Every piece of data that I showed was collected by an undergraduate researcher. And so, yeah, like everybody said, it's been great to be back in the lab, and they just bring their energy and creativity and excitement, and it keeps me going when, I'm tired and want to break, and they're like, but no, we want to collect results and good data. So that's always great. And then, then I can see them grow and learn as individuals, learning so much from research. Some of them start as first year students, and then I can see them over the summers and during the academic year. And now some of them are senior research students, and so they're peer mentoring and training the next group. And so it's just great to be able to get to know them individually and see them grow and flourish and enjoy the process.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I know. I think the undergraduate research is such an important aspect of what we all do, and very happy that UW system acknowledged that and are supporting grant programs like the Regent Scholar and also like the Ignite program for research as well, because all have a heavy emphasis there on incorporating that undergrad component, which is really great, and kind of getting our next set of leaders and researchers and scientists prepared. So, any other questions from our audience? Mark?
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Frick. I thought your research really fascinating, and maybe not surprisingly, it made me think immediately about the different exposure to estrogen levels throughout the life of a male and a female. And so I guess my question maybe is just to comment on that, and then I wonder, do you envision any utility of your efforts in the male brain, or is this exclusively like a female developed therapeutic?
No, yeah, so that's a really good question. And estrogens are actually really important for the male brain too. Aside from reproductive function, estrogens are made in the cognitive regions of the male brain, just like they are in females. And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to understand how estrogens, aside from this particular project, just understand how estrogens work in the brain to mediate memory formation in both sexes. And it turns out that, in at least our experience, estradiol can facilitate memory very similar in a similar way, or at least to a similar extent in males and females, but the underlying molecular mechanisms seem to be different. Which is really interesting and has really big implications for drug development, because if we're assuming that one particular mechanism is regulating memory formation in one sex, say females, but that doesn't work for males, yet we design a drug that works for that mechanism, and it's only going to work in that one sex. And so at this point with our current ER beta agonist, we've been doing our work in females because that's ultimately commercially kind of the target population is menopausal women and menopause symptoms. But there are, it's quite, men get dementia too, men have age-related memory decline as well. And so if it turns out that this compound doesn't have any kind of feminizing effects, because that would obviously be the concern with a hormonal compound for men, then possibly it could be used for cognition for men.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for any of our group of speakers? All right, well, we'll now move on to our next set of speakers. So I'm going to share my screen and just ask everyone to turn their video and audio off as well. All right, wonderful. Well, next up are recipients of our UW System Ignite Grant for Applied Research. And I'd like to first welcome Dr. Ham Kandel from UW Parkside, who is a 1920 grant recipient. Dr. Kandel, you're most welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your introduction and also for inviting for this talk. This is a joint research project between my research lab at the UW Parkside and the Oxide Laboratory at the UW Madison under WiSys UW System Applied Research Grant. Next slide, please. In this talk, I would describe theory, application in the nanofabrication of high temperature superconductor YBCO-based SIS sandwich type Josephson junction device. I would also describe a major challenge on the fabrication and how we overcame this by developing a novel electrical insulator called PBCGO. Then I would also talk about thin film growth process and the different properties of bilayer and trilayer heterostructure of 110 oriented YBCO and PBCGO as part of our process optimization for the nanofabrication. I would conclude my talk by presenting a recently fabricated YBCO-based planar type Josephson junction device if time permits. Next slide, please. Similar to the transistors and the PN junction in silicon electronics, the Josephson junction is a nanoelectronic device in superconductor electronics. This is a device on the right-hand side. As you can see, an extremely thin insulator is sandwiched between two superconductors, and a zero voltage electric current can flow in the junction. And also, if we apply a certain threshold of the electric voltage, then the we can also generate an alternating current with a very high frequency in the terahertz range. Next slide, please. There are many applications. Some of them are such as the squid biomagnetometer sensor that are used in hospitals for monitoring human brain and heart activities. Superconducting qubits to build powerful quantum computers. There are frequency detectors for airport security and space-related applications, and also some digital superconductor circuits. Next slide, please. Here is the design of our SIS YBCO-based Josephson junction device, where we have this extremely thin 110 PVC-GO electrical insulator sandwiched between the two 110 type YBCO superconductors. And the advantage of this design and this device is it can be operated with liquid nitrogen-based cooling system, and due to which the production and operation cost may be reduced to 1.5. Likewise, it may have at least one order of magnitude higher. This figure of merit, also it is IC times Rn product, than in conventional superconductor based Josephson junction devices. Next, please. One of the challenges when fabricating this junction is we need an extremely thin electrical insulator because of the current density that comes out of the Josephson junction is directly related to the thickness of this insulator. For that reason, here the higher the thickness, the lower the J sub C value would be. For that reason, we have to have a very thin electrical insulator. Next slide, please. In a specific, in YBCO, the maximum thickness of the electrical insulator in horizontal geometry, which is also 110 geometry, can be up to 1.2 nanometer. For that reason, we need an electrical insulator which is highly resistive to provide enough electrical potential barrier in the junction. Next slide, please. So we have developed 110 PVC-GO, another novel electrical insulator, which is almost similar to the YBCO. Is demonstrated by this lattice parameter here, and also the structure, universal structure here. And also it has a similar thin film growth condition. Next slide, please. Likewise, the electrical resistivity of this sample, this material is very high. For example, compared to the PVCO, which is the traditional insulator, which is very poor insulator, it has almost 5 order of magnitude higher electrical resistivity at 77 Kelvin. Next, please. So now let me describe about the growth and studies on the heterostructure of 110 type YBCO and PVC-GO. The motivation for this research is to optimize the process for the nanofabrication of this SIS tunneling Josephson junction device. And also there is a very interesting physics in condensed matter physics, such as the 2D superconducting transition, and also the measurement of electron correlation energy. For that reason, we were interested with this research. Next slide, please. So we use a pulse laser based thin film deposition system, what we call in short PLD system. This is the system that we use at the Oxide lab at the UW Madison. And behind this vacuum deposition system is a laser production unit. And on the right hand side, as you can see, this is the schematic diagram of this pulse laser based deposition system, where we use very high UV laser. We strike the target material, something YBCO and PVC-GO, and then evaporate and create the plume, also called the plasma, then allow to condense on the single crystal LA110 substrate on the other side, which is also heated at a high temperature, somewhere 700 to 800 degrees Celsius. By setting different parameters, different variables, we can control the properties of these heterostructure. Second, next slide, please. So we perform different types of testing in heterostructures. For example, X-ray diffraction is one of them. And the reason we perform X-ray diffraction is to check the 110 epitaxy. That is also to check the pure crystalline state of the film. And also the we also perform the XRR to determine the growth rate of the heterostructure. Next slide, please. We need a big, extremely thin, extremely uniform surface morphology in our heterostructure on the surface. For that reason, we use AFM, atomic force microscope, to measure that. And the RMS roughness of one of the sample that one of my students grow last time, it had 2 nanometer in 166 nanometer. Think of this heterostructure. The next slide, please. We also perform electrical resistivity measurement. So first, there is a 110 YBCO base layer. It is about 120 nanometer, and its TC value is about 82 Kelvin, TC0 value. And on the right-hand side, there is a heterostructure where we have 110 PVCGO. On top of that base layer, 110 YBCO, and its TC0 value is almost 82 Kelvin. And likewise, next slide, please. We performed thin film growth and electrical transport measurement of the this heterostructure containing YBCO with a 2.5 nanometer thickness, and then we varied the thickness of the top layer of 110 PVCGO from 1.25 nanometer here to 20 nanometer. And what we saw, interestingly, here is there is the same TC onset value, demonstrating virtually no proximity effect, which is very crucial here for the device fabrication. So this also indicated this PVCGO insulator is very novel. And right now we are working for, next slide, please. We are working with growing tri-layer with YBCO 100 nanometer at the base is the base layer, then PVCGO 60 nanometer in between another YBCO on top. So this is a tri-layer structure, and we are also working to optimize this thickness down to 1 nanometer. But obviously there are different options. The good thing here is our epitaxy, they are perfectly epitaxial, 110 epitaxial, that's what we want. And likewise, the surface morphology is absolutely without any cracks, significant cracks. And likewise, the roughness of the surface is about 3 nanometer. Usually we are looking down 5 nanometer. So for that reason, this is still fine. So next slide, please. So we have also fabricated a planar type of junction, YBCO type of planar junction, and we have filled with the silicon dioxide just to optimize our growth process for SIS tunneling Josephson junction device. So on the right-hand side, this is the picture of this FIB cut, this tri-layer structure with silicon dioxide is an insulator. We have performed some like IV characteristic studies, and we have also measured the J sub C value, but for time limitation of 8 minutes, I didn't like to include that one. So next slide, please. This is the summary and outlook of our research. So to sum up, the Josephson junction is just like the PN junction or transistors in silicon electronics, but this is the key component in superconductor electronics. One of the advantages of this device is that they're almost 1 order of speed faster than semiconductor-based transistors. For that reason, there is a lot of potential to have these devices to develop a superconductor-based several devices. Using pulse laser deposition technique, we have grown device quality, bilayer and tri-layer heterostructures. Right now we are working on the device fabrication of a tunnel junction, SIS tunnel junction, and also measurement of this IC, which is the IC critical current that tunnels through the superconductor from one side of superconductor to another superconductor in the Josephson junction device. And that concludes my talk. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kendall. Are there any questions for Dr. Kendall? Please feel free to enter them in the chat. While we're waiting, Dr. Kendall, one question I would have is you're developing these different bi and tri-layer insulators. What are some next steps in terms of actually getting the technology adopted and actually used in industry, and what might some of your partners look like?
That's an excellent question, Jennifer. So the next process here would be measuring the high value of this ICA times Rn, which is also called the merit of figure of merit of the junction. So our hope is the merit of the figure of merit, which is also an efficiency of junction, that has to be at least 1 order of magnitude higher than in conventional Josephson junction devices. But once, if we achieve that value, then we immediately can go to prototype development, and maybe we have to collaborate with the companies to develop these type of Josephson junction devices.
Great. No, that's really interesting, and good to see that you're at that stage where you're almost to a next step to kind of compare it to industry standards and find a partner to help develop some further prototypes. So thank you so much again, Dr. Kandel, for your time today. Really appreciated your talk. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, well, next up is Dr. Lainey Marshall from UW-Stout, also a 1920 UW System Ignite Grant recipient, and a great example of the research being supported in the social sciences and humanities. So Dr. Marshall, you are most welcome.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this research to you because the information can help more students to graduate from college and more colleges to improve retention rates and decrease their graduation gaps. So this project was called Dagastiri, and it was a 2-part project. Spoiler alert, both parts yielded successful results. Part 1 asked how having a teacher of color during the first semester of college influences student graduation rates. The answer, it increases graduation rates for all students and reduces the graduation gap. Part 2 was a research program on the effects of teaching college teachers how to make their courses more inclusive. This intervention led to a higher year 1 to year 2 retention rate. This intervention is easily replicated and highly portable, so it now has its own ongoing project with a new name, Persist. Next slide, please. Both parts support economic development. To put part 1 results into practice need not cost the university any money. Part 2 or any additional money. Part 2 requires an initial financial investment, but it is highly cost effective. Both parts increase retention, which improves students' economic futures and puts additional college graduates into the workforce, thus improving Wisconsin's economic outlook. Next slide, please. Part 1 of Dagastiri stems from research done in K-12 schools, which shows that Black students who have 1 Black teacher before the end of 3rd grade are 13% more likely to enroll in college. And there are many other studies about the benefits to students of color that come from having a teacher of color. We wanted to see if having a teacher of color during the first semester of college would have similar positive effect. Next slide, please. In analyzing 14 years of student data, we identified students' races and ethnicities through their application demographics. We also selected for first-time, full-time students, so not transfer students and not part-time students. Next slide, please. We identified instructors' races and ethnicities as shown on this slide. That was a little bit trickier. And please note that we did not distinguish among tenured, untenured, or non-tenured track instructors. We looked at, next slide, please. We looked at 4 measures where a teacher of color might make a difference in student success: cumulative GPA, time to graduation, graduation rate, and the graduation gap between students of color and white students. Next slide. Having a professor of color during their first semester at Stout had no effect on cumulative GPA. Next, nor did it affect time to graduation. Next. However, it did improve the graduation rate. Next, and reduce the graduation gap between students of color and white students. Next, more specifically, having a teacher of color in their first semester improved graduation rates for students of color by 2% and improved graduation rates for white students. In part because of Stout's demographics, the overall effect was to reduce the graduation gap by 16%. That's part 1 of Dagastiri. Now for part 2. Next, please. As I said, part 2 is now its own project, Persist. The idea for the project is based on research that shows that at-risk college students are less likely to feel a sense of belonging and less likely to prioritize building solid relationships at school, and these factors influence their likelihood of graduating. Research also suggests that student mindsets have about triple the effect of socioeconomic background on student outcomes. Next, please. So to help all students feel more connected at college, we work with teachers of first-year composition on ways to make their classes more inclusive. Almost all students at Stout take first-year composition classes. Also, composition course objectives are standardized, so teachers were not changing what they taught, just how they taught it. For instructors in the intervention group, we held a 3-day boot camp to provide information about their own intercultural agility, as well as activity, time, and tools for intercultural professional development. We asked the teachers to apply that development to their syllabus and at least one assignment sheet, and to evaluate the revisions with the help of an intercultural consultant. Teachers then brought their revised syllabus and assignments into the classroom for fall semester. Throughout the semester, we met every other week for group discussions and additional professional development. Next, please. The timeline looks like this. In the spring, we recruited the participants, 8 people, 4 who were in the control group and 4 who were in the intervention group. During the summer, for the people in the intervention group, we ran the boot camp and the teachers revised and reviewed their documents. In the fall, they taught their course and attended group discussions and professional development meetings. And then the following fall, we analyzed the retention data. Next. And found that this intervention indeed had a positive effect on the instructors, the students, a 3% increase in retention rates, and also improved the fiscal stability of some students and the institutions. I'll address these elements in the next few slides. Next. Instructors improved in quantitative measures of intercultural agility. Furthermore, they were tremendously positive about the experience, both for themselves, as you can see here, and for their students, as you'll see on the next slide in just a moment. 2 pieces of feedback that we learned from. Number 1, the instructors felt underprepared in their knowledge of university resources to help support students in times of crisis, because students were more willing to bring their crises to these teachers. And number 2, they found that in part because of that, teaching this class took more time and emotional energy. We've made changes to the program to address both of these pieces of feedback. Next. Students did not know that their class was any different than usual. Thus, we asked the instructors to report the differences in student responses. This is a representative sample of their comments. So it's a positive experience for students, and more of them end up persisting in their university progress towards a degree. Next. We then extrapolated, based on 15 years of student data, what would happen if all first-year students had a composition teacher with this training, with an overall 3% increase in year 1 to year 2 retention, even if the retention rates were not at all unchanged or not at all changed in the other years. The answer is it would increase the number of students at Stout by the amount shown in the right-hand column. And as you can see, it builds from first year number increase of 0 up to about a little bit over 100, ranging from 100 to 107, depending on how many students were in the incoming class. $17,000 per student per year is an approximation based on the chancellor's estimate of how much we get per capita for students. So this project costs $50,000 for a cohort of 4 intervention instructors. If we did this intervention with, say, 20 composition instructors, that would cost about $250,000, which would be recouped 3 times over in the second year of the project. Thus, this program is good for students' financial stability and for the university's financial stability. Next. Next steps for this project at Stout. We are working with the Nakatani Teaching and Learning Center to follow the first cohort of students and their into year 2 to 3 retention rate. So we're going to measure that in September, we hope. And then with the Nakatani Teaching and Learning Center, we're working with the Provost's Office and the University Foundation to fund a second cohort of instructors. Next, what this means beyond Stout. This intervention is highly portable. All elements can be done remotely except for the 3-day boot camp. Also, if enough campuses were interested, we could run a train the trainer program. We're looking forward to seeing what the response is from the campuses. Next. I appreciate your time and your interest in this project, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Lainey. That was really interesting. And again, a great example of the social sciences, in addition to, science and technology projects, the UW System Ignite program also supports these projects. And it just, in addition to the societal impact, it has certainly a lot of economic impact, as you have demonstrated here. Any questions from our audience for Lainey? Please feel free to enter in the chat or just turn your video and audio on. Thanks, Lenny. While we're waiting, I do have a question. You kind of touched upon this in your last slide, is, thinking about how this could be deployed outside of STOUT and beyond, and it looks like it is fairly scalable and transferable. Do you have, a means to sustain the project or continue development outside, or any thoughts around that?
We're working with the University Foundation to try and put something like that into place. We don't currently have the funding available for that.
Okay, and are you looking for other partners within the UW system or outside?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought of, I'm not quite sure where I would begin to do that. This is a new kind of research area for me. And so I would be happy to take suggestions from people and recommendations of what to do next.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Well, next up, I'd like to welcome, you had 2 more slides, Dr. Laney.
Those were just in case people had questions about the data, but I think there was one question in the chat.
Yep. Yes, from Dr. Levinson. Do you have any data or speculation on how the minority teacher effect influences first-generation college students?
So I don't have any data on that. I do know that the 13% for the Black students in K-12 school actually grows to almost 40% depending on income. And so I would extrapolate from that if we had more first-gen teachers coming out as first-gen teachers, we would see a similar effect in helping support first-gen students. I mean, for teachers of color and for white teachers, each of those groups of teachers has more confidence in the ability of people who look like them to succeed in college. And that changes the students' willingness to persist. And so the more we can get examples of teachers who are willing to be clear about their backgrounds and where they're coming from, the more we're going to help students from a wider variety of backgrounds.
Thank you. And I think there's one more question. You might have touched upon this, but can you conjecture on what theoretical perspectives may explain mechanisms for white students' increased retention after having a professor of color? And he notes if he's grasping the findings correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are looking at these correctly. And what the research data suggests is that everyone benefits when there's more diversity. And so we get all students becoming more engaged in their education when there is that visible diversity, because diversity brings in more perspectives and students feel like their learning experience is more broadly applicable.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Dr. Marshall, for your time today, and really appreciate sharing your results with us. Look forward to hearing more.
Thank you so much.
All right, next up, I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Mitchell from UW Oshkosh, our final 1920 UW System Ignite grant recipient. Dr. Mitchell, you're most welcome.
Thank you. And I realize this title is a bit much to swallow, but we'll unpack this over the course of the talk. And hopefully everybody will be on board with the idea that we're basically taking an insect pest and using its sense of smell against it. Next slide, please. So sense of smell, that's the olfactory system. It's not something we think about too much. Humans don't really rely on their sense of smell. If you ask somebody what's the most important sense, smell unfortunately rates way down at the bottom of those responses. And really, that's not surprising for humans. Evolutionarily, we've been moving away from a sense of smell for thousands of years. But it can bias us against some biological systems because there's a lot of animals for which smell is really critical. Next slide. So insects in particular depend almost entirely on olfaction. There are odors that come out of their food sources that bring them to that food. We call those attractants. There are odors that can make them avoid low quality food, help them choose, put them away, move them out of the way of predators or other dangers. So we call those inhibitors and repellents. And insects talk to each other using their sense of smell. When they exchange information as odors, those are pheromones. It can be as simple as an insect advertising that it's available to mate, or it can be incredibly complex whole societies that are founded on the interchange of pheromones like ants or bees or wasps. So odor is important. And next slide. You can see that if you look at the head of an insect. So this is a male moth, and you'll notice the huge structure coming out of the head, the antenna. That's the main organ of smell. And this antenna is covered in hairs. And if you look at the inset in the bottom of the right, you can see the hairs are covered in hairs. There's a lot of surface area. And reputedly, this moth is capable of detecting a single odor molecule that passes through its antenna, in this case, the female produced pheromone. Next slide. So next part of the title, what's inside those little hairs are odorant receptors. And so I mentioned odorant receptor genes as one of our focuses here. This is physically how an odor is smelled. An odorant receptor, or OR, is a protein, and it basically has a little pocket inside of it that is the same shape as a particular chemical compound, or the odorant. And if that odorant fits inside the pocket, then that triggers the nervous system, it sends information up to the brain, and you've just smelled something. So there are potentially hundreds of different types of odorant receptors, each with its own little shape. Sometimes this is actually a perfect one-to-one fit. So for instance, a labeled line is when there's a single odor it can detect, and that triggers the nervous system. But there's a 4 billion different chemicals that could be smelled. You can't have an OR for each of them. And so more realistically, what we see is a combination of ORs that activate. It fits some ORs fairly well, kind of like a switchboard with different parts lighting up. And that particular combination is what codes the particular odor. All right, next slide. So we're looking at this in the context of a particular insect species, and that's the Colorado potato beetle. So CPB is one of the most important potato pests, and potato itself is a very high value crop. So it's about a $4 billion industry in the US. CPB eats the adults and the larvae, eat the leaves, and it will defoliate an entire potato field if it's not controlled. You may not know what a healthy potato plant looks like, but I can assure you that is not a healthy potato plant on the right. It's missing most of its leaves, courtesy of that beetle. Now, we have a lot of insects that do this sort of thing, and there's a fairly straightforward way to deal with it. You spray them with insecticide. But through some quirk of evolution, CPB is remarkably adept at adapting to insecticides. And so as new classes of insecticides are released, the beetle inevitably finds its way around them biochemically. And this is estimated to cost tens of millions of dollars just in Wisconsin, because you have to apply more pesticides and the beetles cause more damage before they're ultimately killed off. So we need an alternative to pesticides to properly control CPB and try to improve yield. Next slide. So that brings us back to smell. Just like any other insect, CPB uses odors to find its food, potato plants, and find mates through pheromones. So we have a lot of different possibilities for controlling the beetle using odors. You can use attractants to tell when beetles are present or bring them into a particular location, a trap, and kill them with a poison. You could try to mask perhaps smaller fields using repellents. You can combine the two, so you can use repellents to push beetles away from one location, attractants to bring them to another, and maybe they're more easily controlled in that area, and that's called a push-pull strategy. All of these very effective if you have the odors and they are sufficiently inexpensive to warrant use. So next slide. So that brings us to the goals of our project. Our idea is to identify some of these odors by reverse engineering the olfactory system. So our first major project goal was to fully establish a method to shut down these ORs in living beetles. So one by one, we can close down these genes. And next slide, thank you. Then you can, once you've knocked out one of these genes, then you can see what's changed. So what odors can it no longer smell? And we want to identify which of these ORs are associated with the potato smells and with pheromones. So we can get a list of these, thank you. And then as our third goal, we can, once we have the OR, we can put it in another biological system, something we can drum up in the lab and just screen hundreds of compounds against it. And the idea is to identify shapes that fit just a little bit better into that OR, so something that's more powerful, or maybe something that fits the same, but it's cheaper. And so it can be an alternative to a known attractant. All right, next slide. So I'm going to run quickly through the methods here since I don't have a huge amount of time. Very superficial overview of this last part of my title phrase, which is RNAi, or RNA interference. My collaborator, Sean Scoville, this is one of his specialties. And again, very superficially, the idea is that you can inject a beetle, a living adult, with a modified copy of this OR. It's double-stranded RNA, if you have some biology. And this triggers a series of processes that makes the cells destroy all of the active copies of this gene. So it's removed the OR now from the system. Next slide. And then one of my specialties is Electro Entenography, which is a big word that basically means I stick some needles into the antenna, and we can record the nerve impulses as the beetle is moving around. And well, actually I cut off the antenna, but in any case, as the odors are blown over the antenna, then you can record whether or not it can detect it, or if it detects it a little bit less. And so in this way, we can get an idea of what the OR was associated with. So next slide. So this is just some data showing how our methods are functional. Always good to see. We've got 3 different odors here on the bottom, just nothing as a control, a crushed leaf of potato, and then a very particular compound, E2-hexanol, which is, we know they like that from leaves. And beetles that are sham injected with water, we can see an increasing rate of response in the antenna to these odors. Beetles that are injected with a particular odorant receptor, dsRNA, this is RNA interference. This gene Orco is an OR, but it's kind of a master switch. So it can be basically turn off all the senses of smell. And in this case, we can see that once we inject, the beetle can no longer smell things. So it works. That's great. Next slide. So we've got the methods worked out now. We're in the process of identifying which ORs are associated with these key odors. And we do have a little bit of promising data, but this is a short talk and it's a little preliminary. So I'm going to shy away from that today. But hopefully we can get some of these ORs and move on to goal 3. And I'm sure I'm out of time, so we'll skip to the next slide. I just want to make sure to thank several undergrads who worked on this project, Dr. Russell Groves, who helped us at UW-Madison, who helped us collect some beetles, and of course, WiSys for the funding. And with that, I will take any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Mitchell. Any questions from our audience? Again, please feel free to enter them in the chat or raise your hand to turn your video on, audio on, and just ask away. I guess while we're waiting to see if any come in, one question I have is, has anyone tried this before? Or, if so, are there deficiencies in what they've done? Is this a new mechanism?
Yeah, good question. I'm not the only person who's working on this stuff. People have tried RNAi to shut down olfaction before, but in this beetle, no, nobody else has tried RNAi yet. So getting it to work in the beetle was a big first step.
Great, and it looks like Dr. Levinson, you have a question?
I do, yeah, and I don't think I have. It's too long a question to enter into the chat. So I just want to ask: do you imagine that there's enough specificity for the specific beetle receptors that you could imagine generating a GMO potato that expresses the appropriate RNAi as a means of fending off this pest?
So that's a good question. So the question is, can the plant itself shut down the genes, right, in the beetle as it's feeding on it? Probably you could do this. RNAi has been expressed in crop plants to try to do that sort of thing, usually to poison the insects that feed on it. In this case, it could probably be done. It's questionable as to whether it would be useful at that point, though, because once the beetles are in the field and eating, then they're reproducing. They're whether or not they can smell the field becomes kind of a moot point once they're already in it. So shutting down the OR at that point, I don't know if there would be a lot of commercial application there.
Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks, Dr. Mitchell, for sharing your results. I know we look forward to hearing more from you, and a really great example of another, multi-institution, project with UW-Madison, and great to see you two collaborating together. So thanks again for sharing these results with us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Our final speaker today is actually a WiSys Spark grant recipient whose research was supported during the 1920 grant cycle as well. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Pranabindhu Mitra from UW Stout. Dr. Mitra, you're most welcome.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So welcome to my presentation today. I think everybody is preparing for dinner, and last presentation is also related to food, although it's virtual. So today I will be talking about the development of the valuable cookies by fortifying Cranberry pumice, fruits, and vegetables. Next slide, please. So first question maybe comes here that why we need to fortify it with Cranberry pumice. Okay. So now if you look at that, each year in the US, about 900 to 1,000 millions of pounds cranberries are being produced. And the annual value, market value in the US is about 3.55 billion. And Wisconsin is leading that in the cranberry processing industry by contributing about $1 billion. So about 95% cranberry are being used to develop different kind of valuable products. For example, cranberry juice. So when you develop cranberry juice, so after extracting juice, you will be getting seed and skin. These are called pumice. And huge amount of pumice are being produced every year. And it is a huge challenge for the cranberry processing industry because they cannot dump this huge amount of pumices and for landfill because of low pH and uncontrolled fermentation. So they need to spend extra money to treat these pumices. But you can see that this pumice contains very high amount of anthocyanins and polyphenolic compounds, which directly contribute to that your antioxidant. And also it has, in dry pumice, has about 70% soluble and non-soluble fiber. So if you can convert this waste into food, that will be very important for the sustainability for the cranberry processing industry. So next slide, please. And now next question is that why we need fruits and vegetable fortification. If you look at the data or recommendation for that guidelines for Americans, dietary guidelines for Americans, it shows that about 80% US population does not meet that fruit recommendations and 90% does not meet that your vegetable recommendations. On the other hand, about 1/3 of the fruits and vegetables each year is wasting due to the lack of proper post-harvest process. So in this case, if you can incorporate the fruits and vegetable process properly, you can at least contribute to that dietary intake. And other thing is that day by day, consumer demand is that they are looking for more nutritional value in that product by cutting carbohydrates. So next slide, please. So the objectives of the study were that optimizing that value-added cookies formulation. That means we need to know that how much fruits and vegetables we can incorporate with that based on developing physical and nutritional value. So, and second is how we can enhance that fiber and antioxidant in the cookie formulation. Next slide, please. So this is the total experimental plan for this study. And we divide it in the two phases. First phase is that we try to optimize the formulations, that how much, that when you develop the cookies, mainly 100% your wheat flour, but how we can cut the wheat flours and how much we can cut with the fruits and vegetables. So we develop 7 different formulations replacing 25 to 50% fruits and vegetables and combination of them. And then we try to measure that quality, the quality of the product, for example, water activity, color, pitch density, spread tissue, hardness, because they are directly related to the consumer acceptance. So from the first phase, we optimize the level of the incorporation or fortification of the fruits and vegetables. And second phase, we added Cranberry Pumice to increase that your antioxidant capacity and fiber content. And we determine that this value based on the physicochemical properties and nutritional analysis. Next slide, please. The result, first phase result. So as I mentioned that we developed 7 different formulations with the combination of the fruits and vegetables and wheat flour. So first sample is that 100% wheat flour that is controlled, and then we replace that wheat flour with fruits and vegetables, and you can see that 25%, 50%. And within this 7 formulations, you can see that based on the physicochemical properties we determine, we see that sample 2 and sample 4 shows the improved physicochemical properties that which will be a good product for the consumer acceptance. So in this case, you see that physical and first third column, you can see the water activity. So in this water activity number 4, you see that 0.61. So usually when you have water activity less than 6, that is better for extension of the shelf life. So now we consider, although it's a higher water activity, but we assume that when you incorporate with the Cranberry Pumice, that may change the water activity, lower the water activity. That's why we selected 2 formulations here. That means 25% replacement with flour with vegetables and 25% with flour replacement with fruits. And in the fruits, we use the 1:1:1:1, apple, mango, and pear. And vegetables, we use carrot, sweet potato, and pumpkin. Next slide, please. So when you get the 2 formulations, then we reformulated that formulation, and then we added Cranberry Pumice 5 to 15%. And then we determined that your physicochemical properties. And here we can see that in the sample 4 and 7, they showed better quality, improved your physicochemical properties. So that means we can incorporate up to 15% Cranberry Pumice, which can improve the physicochemical properties. And also you look at here in third column that water activity dropped, drastically dropped from 0.61 to 0.44. So that means it's very good for the shelf life extension. So then we can consider the 2 formulations, formula 4 and formula 7 will be good for our final product. And next slide, please. And then in terms of the nutritional value, you can look at here. So when we incorporate our Cranberry Pumice, it shows that we were able to increase, like your control, you see that fiber is 1.19%. Whereas when we increase fruits and vegetables and the Cranberry Pumice, we have got about 4.94%. And on the other hand, antioxidant value, you can see that in control, it has only 3.6. And now it increased up to 18.7. So a huge change elevation, we can see the nutrition quality just using that byproduct, Cranberry Pumice. Next slide, please. So now significance of this study. So in this study shows that we are able to cut at least 25% of carbohydrate by replacing your fruit or vegetables. And then we can increase that fiber content up to 4 times compared to control, and antioxidant will be 6 times compared to control by the combination of fruits and vegetables and Cranberry Pumice. And Cranberry Pumice can be added up to 15%. And what I'm saying is that as we are able to increase the nutrition quality, and also we see that the improved physicochemical properties of that formulation, those formulation, that strong potential for the commercial. Result of the study, we are expecting that it will be helpful for the sustainability and for the Cranberry processing industry, as well as for the fruit and vegetables producer or growers. Next slide, please. So we are thankful for our WiSys grant because this research was supported by the Spark grant. And I also like to acknowledge my 3 graduate students, Kavita Parajuli, then Rushali Mistry and Yang Maither, who worked for this project as a research assistant, and then they collected and analyzed data, this one. And next slide, please. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Mitra. Any questions for Dr. Mitra? Please feel free to enter them in the chat or raise your hand and turn your audio on. One question, maybe missed during the talk, but how much does cranberry pomace affect the flavor when it replaces wheat?
Okay, so in flavor part, now we can see that due to that our COVID situation, so we were not able to do that mass level our sensory evaluation, because we go for the product development, sensory evaluation is the important part. But we did sensory evaluation like unofficially, for example, our student group, so who do that research, and also I brought the product by home to feed my kids. And we see that when we are using the Cranberry pomace, because it has the pH, so it's little bit sour compared to that normal pH. And that is also good in the sense you can get little bit souring flavor, and also it will be helpful for you extending the shelf life.
Thank you. And have you tried other pomaces from other fruits, such as cherries or other things?
No, at this moment we did not try other pomaces because we are just considering Cranberry pomace, because when actually this concept we developed due to our class project first, and then I try to see that what is growing in Wisconsin. And then I see the Cranberry processing industry is working in that, and then I talk to them, can we get some pomace with them? So this will actually start our research in this project. They were very interested about it. When they listened to my concept, they actually right away sent me about 50 pounds dry pomace to for this research. So that's why we are just concentrating on that Cranberry pomace. But in future, we are planning to incorporate because we need to also compare for looking for other pomace, how they are comparable, and is there any difference? Because you think that when you added different kind of pomace, that can be also change your flavor and also physicochemical properties. So that is also needed. So this is we are thinking to do that. But this time we did not compare it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Mitra. Really appreciate your time. And again, look forward to seeing more what's coming out of your lab in the future. So thanks again.
Yeah, sure.
So now I'd invite everybody to turn their video and audio on and come together for any further Q&A with our second group of presenters. Again, feel free to just turn your video on, ask questions, raise your hand, enter them in the chat. I'm sure our 4 speakers would welcome any further questions from anyone in the audience. Any questions? I'll maybe ask a question of each of you while others are thinking. I turn my video on first. So each of you were recipients of the UW System Applied Research Grant Funding or WiSys grant funding, all of which is really applied towards applied research, things that have economic potential, innovation, IP. How critical has this initial kind of seed funding been for your research project? And do you envision that it will help leverage further funding down the road for you as a result of the data you've been generating? So Dr. Kandel, I'll start with you.
Yes, sure. So this has been really helpful to generate some data, and still we are working on collecting more data. And at the same time, I'm working with the DOE funding at this time. So if we get some fruitful data, and there is some chances of getting even getting DOE funding, but I'm right now working on that funding. So definitely this helped me to collect some important data. And I mean, it provided me some foundation to write the DOE grant, which is something like about at least like $250,000 something.
Great. No, we'll look forward to that. I know UW System are always very interested in how, the funding that they're able to provide helps to leverage, further monies down the road. So that's great that you're pursuing other avenues. Dr. Marshall?
Oh, it was absolutely crucial because there's a lot of data out there that says this thing does this in K-12, or that the reason students do or do not persist is because of this. And that being able to connect those dots to, okay, well, what does work, and does that work at the university level is really important, so that we can take this preliminary data to places like the Spencer Foundation or the William T. Grant Foundation, which support the education of students, particularly at-risk students or underrepresented students, and say, look, we have data that shows this is going to be an actual, it's going to make a real change. It doesn't just make people feel better, it makes people have a life with a college degree versus not having a life with a college degree. And that's helpful in being really persuasive in expanding the program. So yeah, it's been great. It's and really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mitchell?
Yeah, well, research is expensive. Definitely wouldn't have happened. RNAi is not cheap. And without this money, we wouldn't have been able to get a lot of this off the ground. There's a lot of trial and error involved. And so a small amount of money for 1 or 2 kits isn't going to get you very far. It needs to be more of an input than that. So we are hoping to take this on to other funding sources. The Potato Vegetable Growers Association or the USDA are both good avenues to keep this ball rolling. Yeah.
That's great to hear. And lastly, Dr. Mitra.
Okay, so how crucial this fund is now, I can share my little bit experience. When I joined in 2017 here, and then I was not able to buy because only $2,000 I got for funding. And then you say that if you like to buy simple thing, $2,000 is nothing. So I was struggling, and I thought I had one master thesis student, and I saw that I had a big problem to provide him support. So then I looked for the industry a little bit grant. So now these things I faced initially. So then try to apply for that our university faculty research institute grant. I didn't get it first. Then I applied, then I got it. And now you say that from WiSys I got one. So now this is very crucial in this sense that you need to, if you like to do the research, you need money. So if you don't get grant, how can you do that? So for this WiSys grant, now you say that I partially supported one master's thesis. And also I supported 3 students for their non-thesis project. So if I don't get this money, how can I support this one? And that this is that academic part. And other part is there's no small data, whatever data I showed you is very potential for the commercial purpose. So now look for here, we do research on lab base. So when you like to go commercial base, if I like to take it in the commercial stage, that I did it in the lab base. So lab base, I did it like 1 kg to 5 kg product in the one formulation. But then next stage is I need to go for pilot scale. So then when I go for pilot scale, then I need to go for 20 kg to 200 kg product for one formulation. So now you say that then commercial stage. So each stage, if you look for that, when I go for 20 kg to 200 kg, then you say that how much material I need and how much resources, personal resources I need. So if I don't get the money, so it's very difficult for me to continue for that. So that's why grant is very important. And in this case, I'm very thankful for the WiSys for helping me for contributing to my research.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Major. Just very kind words. And we're certainly, very happy to be able to support these early stage projects, even with small pots of money, because we're glad to see that, they can lead to bigger pots of money, such as the Ignite program or Regent Scholar, and further afield to, federal opportunities and foundation grants. So really great to see such a great showcase of research here today. Any final questions from the audience?
Jennifer, this is Tracy. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Tracy.
I do have one question for Dr. Mitchell. It has to do with the mechanism of the olfactory system, and presumably that mechanism, that sort of protein binding mechanism, is the same in humans. I know we're reaching the end of the time, so in 2 sentences or less, could he help us understand, if the mechanism is the same, then why is human sensitivity so much lower than other animals?
Oh boy, well, I could give you a lecture. So the first point, humans and insects actually have 2 different lineages of receptors, although they end up doing pretty much the same thing in terms of having the little binding pocket. Second, sensitivity is a different issue than specificity, if that makes sense. So each different type of odorant receptor is specific, but there are other things that contribute to how sensitive you are to a particular odor. So think about the length of your nose versus the length of a dog's nose. So dogs have high sensitivity because there's a huge amount of surface area that those odors pass over on the way, in through their respiratory system, whereas we've got a tiny little patch at the top of our nose. And so that's also going to govern how sensitive an individual is to particular odors. Hope that answered it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much, everyone. Really, another big round of applause for all of our speakers here today. We really appreciate your time and taking the time to join us for this virtual showcase. I'd like to thank everyone else for joining us. A special thanks to Regent Weatherly for being here with us today. Also, Tracy, a big shout out to you, because Tracy, as some of you may not know, co-chairs with me the Ignite grant program for UW System, and as part of their SIM initiatives there. We hope everyone enjoyed the presentations today, as well as the Q&A. Thanks for the thoughtful discussion. Again, conversations don't have to start here. So if there's any way we can help connect you to anyone, or if you have a need for a collaborator, please let WiSys help you with that. I do want to also point out we have a great lineup of events coming up in July and August for the remainder of our virtual series. Just tomorrow, we've got an entrepreneurial mindset for researchers. In August, we have more of our innovation meetups around data science, as well as STEM education, and some good opportunities for your students around graduate and professional school advice, grant writing, and also a further student showcase later in the month. And finally, a faculty grant seeking dialogue, helping folks kind of get that external funding. So again, really thank you so much for your time today. Again, thanks to all of our speakers. We hope you enjoyed the event. Please check out more at wisys.org/spark, and we will see you next time. So thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.